Still trying to get rich? My son-in-law Kyle mocked at Christmas dinner, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured toward my laptop. My daughter Brenna added with a laugh that felt like a slap. She can't keep steady work, all because I'd mentioned my online knitting course had gained some traction. Then, in perfect timing that felt orchestrated by the universe itself, the TV news began. Local entrepreneur becomes millionaire through innovative online education platform. My face filled the screen, and the room fell silent as death. Tell us your city below, hit subscribe, and get ready for today's story. Let's start. You should have seen their faces. Kyle's fork froze halfway to his mouth, loaded with the turkey I'd spent 6 hours preparing. Brenna's wine glass hovered in midair like she'd been turned to stone. Even my grandchildren, Emma and Jake, stopped their usual Christmas chaos to stare at the television where their supposedly unsuccessful grandmother was being interviewed about her multi-million-dollar business. Margaret Thompson of Cedar Falls has revolutionized online crafting education, the reporter continued, turning her passion for knitting into a business empire worth over $750,000. Her Stitch Your Dreams platform now serves students in 47 countries. I'd known this interview was airing tonight. What I hadn't expected was the exquisite timing of Kyle's public humiliation of me just moments before. Sometimes the universe has a sense of humor that even I couldn't have scripted better. "Mom," Brenna's voice came out as a croak, That's you on TV." I reached for my wine glass with steady hands, though inside I was practically vibrating with satisfaction. "Yes, dear, it is." Kyle had gone an interesting shade of green that clashed terribly with his expensive Christmas sweater. The same sweater I'd noticed still had the price tag artfully tucked inside the collar. $500. I wondered if they'd put it on a credit card they couldn't afford, just like everything else in their perfect suburban life. "But you never said anything," Kyle stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating like steam from the forgotten gravy boat. "You never asked," I replied, taking a delicate sip of wine. "In fact, if I recall correctly, your exact words last Thanksgiving were that my little hobby was cute, but I should focus on finding real work." The reporter's voice continued from the television. Thompson's success story began during the pandemic when she lost her teaching job after 30 years. Rather than despair, she saw opportunity. "Lost my job." They made it sound so simple. What actually happened was that budget cuts forced early retirement on anyone over 50, and suddenly I found myself staring at a future of substitute teaching and food stamps. But I hadn't shared those fears with my family. Why burden them with an old woman's problems? The platform started with just 12 students, the TV continued. Now it boasts over 50,000 active learners and has generated partnerships with major craft retailers worldwide. 50,000 students. I let that number hang in the air while Kyle struggled to process this new reality. This was the same man who'd suggested just last month that I might want to consider moving to a senior community because maintaining a house was probably too much for someone my age. "Mrs. Thompson," the reporter had asked during filming, "what advice do you have for other entrepreneurs starting later in life?" I remembered my answer clearly. Don't let anyone convince you that your best years are behind you, and never, ever let family members treat you like you're already dead just because you've hit 50. Brenna set down her wine glass with shaking hands. "Mom, why didn't you tell us?" "We're your family." "Are you?" I wanted to ask. Because family members don't usually spend dinner parties competing to see who can deliver the most cutting remarks about your failures. But I maintained my composure. "Well, you seemed so certain it would never amount to anything," I said pleasantly. "I didn't want to get your hopes up." The interview concluded with footage of my home office, the same room where Kyle had sarcastically suggested I install a ramp for when the arthritis gets worse. The camera panned over my awards, my computer setup, the wall of thank you letters from students around the world. "This Christmas certainly took an unexpected turn," I observed, cutting myself another slice of pie. "Anyone else want dessert?" The silence that followed my casual dessert offer stretched like taffy. You could practically hear the gears grinding in Kyle's head as he tried to recalculate every interaction we'd had over the past 3 years. Meanwhile, Brenna kept glancing between me and the television as if she expected one of us to disappear like a mirage. "Grandma," Emma piped up with the brutal honesty only 7-year-olds possess, "Daddy said you were poor and couldn't afford nice things. But millionaires aren't poor, right? From the mouths of babes. Kyle's face flushed deep red, and I had to bite my lip to keep from smiling. Children have this wonderful way of exposing adult hypocrisy without even trying. No, sweetheart, I said gently. Millionaires are not poor. Would you like some ice cream with your pie? Yes, please, the expensive kind. Even Jake, at 5, seemed to understand that something significant had shifted in the family dynamic. He kept staring at me like I'd suddenly grown wings, which honestly wasn't far from how I felt. Kyle cleared his throat, apparently deciding to attempt damage control. Maggie, this is incredible news, really incredible. Why don't we talk about how we can help you manage all of this? There it was. Less than 10 minutes after learning about my success, and he was already positioning himself as my financial advisor. The audacity was almost impressive. Manage what exactly? I asked, spooning ice cream into Emma's bowl with deliberate precision. Well, investments, tax planning, making sure you don't get taken advantage of by unscrupulous people. Unscrupulous people. Like him, perhaps? I'd noticed his eyes had lit up when the reporter mentioned $750,000. I could practically see him calculating his share of my theoretical inheritance, probably already planning the kitchen renovation they'd been talking about for months. I appreciate the concern, I said, but I have excellent financial advisors already. Have had them for 2 years now. 2 years. Let them chew on that. 2 years during which they'd made jokes about my computer time and suggested I take up something more age-appropriate, like gardening or bird watching. 2 years while I was building an empire and they were building assumptions about my limitations. Brenna finally found her voice. Mom, I'm sorry about what we said earlier. We just didn't understand. Understand what? That a 54-year-old woman might be capable of learning new technology? That someone you've written off as past her prime might actually be hitting her stride? The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but honestly, I'd been swallowing their condescension for so long that having it finally out in the open felt like lancing an infected wound. We never wrote you off, Kyle protested, but his heart wasn't in it. He knew exactly what he'd done. Really? Last month you suggested I get tested for early-onset dementia because I forgot to return your call within 6 hours. 6 hours, Kyle. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. I was just concerned. You were concerned about my mental capacity. But somehow it never occurred to you to be concerned about my financial capacity. Interesting priorities. Emma, bless her heart, was listening to this exchange with fascination while methodically eating her ice cream. Children are natural observers of adult drama, filing away every contradiction for future reference. What does millionaire mean? Jake asked suddenly. It means Grandma has lots and lots of money, Emma explained with authority. More than Daddy. Much more than Daddy, if the whispered phone calls I'd overheard about credit card debt were any indication. But I wasn't quite ready to drop that particular bomb. Not yet. Money isn't everything, Brenna said quickly, shooting a warning glance at Emma. No, I agreed, but respect is, and it's remarkable how much easier respect becomes when people can't dismiss you as financially irrelevant. The adult conversation was clearly making Kyle uncomfortable. He kept fidgeting with his phone, probably calculating how to spin this development to his advantage. I'd seen that calculating look before, usually right before he suggested ways I could be more helpful to their household. Maybe we should talk about this privately, he suggested, glancing meaningfully at the children. Why? Are you planning to say something you wouldn't want them to hear? The question hung in the air like smoke. Because that was exactly what he'd been planning, wasn't it? Some private conversation about how we were all family and families shared their good fortune. How my success was really everyone's success. How surely I'd want to help my daughter and her family achieve their dreams. I stood up and began clearing the dessert plates, noting with satisfaction that Kyle had barely touched his pie. Stress eating, apparently, was only for the poor. You know what the best part of this whole evening has been? I asked, conversationally, while stacking dishes. Watching you both realize that you've been talking down to someone you should have been taking seriously all along. That's when I knew this was just the beginning. 3 days after Christmas, my phone started ringing, and ringing, and ringing. The first call came from Brenna at 8:30 in the morning, just as I was settling into my morning routine of coffee and email responses from students in different time zones. Nothing quite like starting your day with gratitude messages from a grandmother in Australia who'd just finished her first sweater. "Mom, I've been thinking," Brenna began without preamble, "about Christmas dinner and how we reacted to your news." I'd been expecting this call. They'd had 72 hours to digest the reality of my financial independence, which was apparently just enough time to craft a strategic response. "Have you now?" I said, opening an email from my accountant about quarterly tax payments. Being wealthy, it turns out, involves a surprising amount of paperwork. We handled it badly. Kyle feels terrible about his comments, and I realize I've been treating you like you're helpless instead of recognizing how capable you are. The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in front of a mirror. Probably had, knowing Brenna. She'd always been my theatrical child, the one who could summon tears on command when she wanted something. I hummed non-committally while reviewing my business calendar. I had a video conference with my web developer at 10, and a potential partnership meeting with a European craft supplier after lunch. Busy day in the helpless senior citizen business. "So we were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend. Just us, family time. Kyle's making his famous lasagna. Famous lasagna. The same recipe he'd stolen from my kitchen after I made it for them last year, then claimed credit for perfecting it. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was now offering to cook my own recipe as a peace offering. "That's very thoughtful," I said, "but I'm actually busy this weekend." "Busy?" The surprise in her voice was almost insulting. What could possibly keep a 54-year-old grandmother busy on a weekend? "I'm flying to New York for a business meeting. Potential investors for my next platform expansion." Silence. Then, "You're flying to New York? For business?" "Yes, dear. People with businesses often travel for meetings. It's quite common." I could practically hear her recalibrating again. In her mind, I'd gone from unemployed burden to mysterious business mogul in the span of one holiday dinner. The whiplash must have been exhausting. "Well, what about the following weekend? I'll check my calendar and let you know." After hanging up, I allowed myself a small smile. The truth was, I was busy this weekend, but not with business travel. I was having lunch with my neighbor Dorothy to celebrate her granddaughter's college acceptance, then spending Saturday evening at a wine tasting with my book club. Simple pleasures that I'd been free to enjoy ever since I stopped organizing my life around other people's convenience. The second call came from Kyle at noon, just as I was finishing my video conference about adding live virtual workshops to my platform. He'd clearly drawn the short straw for the next attempt. "Maggie, hey, it's Kyle," as if I didn't have caller ID. "Listen, I wanted to call and apologize personally for Christmas. That was really out of line." Yes, it was. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. Let him work for his rehabilitation. The man had spent 3 years treating me like a charity case, and now he wanted absolution because he'd discovered I wasn't actually pitiable? I guess I just didn't realize how successful your business had become. "You're so modest about your achievements." Modest. That was a generous interpretation of my silence about my income while they made jokes about my financial irrelevance. I wasn't being modest, Kyle. I was protecting myself. Protecting yourself? From what? From this exact conversation, I wanted to say. From the moment when your love becomes contingent on my usefulness. From watching you calculate my worth based on my bank balance instead of my humanity. From having my value to the family suddenly depend on my financial status instead of our relationships. We don't. He struggled with the words because we both knew it was exactly what was happening. Kyle, 3 weeks ago, you suggested I might want to consider downsizing to a senior apartment because maintaining a house was probably getting to be too much. Yesterday, you texted asking if I'd looked into investment opportunities lately. What changed? His voice trailed off. What changed? Kyle, is that you now see dollar signs when you look at me, and that tells me everything I need to know about what I meant to you before. That's not fair, isn't it? When's the last time you called me just to chat? When's the last time you asked about my interests without rolling your eyes? When's the last time you treated me like a person instead of an obligation? He couldn't answer, because we both knew the answer was never. Look, he said finally, maybe we got off on the wrong foot over the years, but we're family. Family supports each other. There it was, the magic word. Support, which in Kyle speak meant subsidize our lifestyle while pretending it's about love. You're absolutely right about family supporting each other, I said sweetly. It's just fascinating how that support only started being important to you after you found out I could afford it. I hung up before he could respond, but I was grinning. This was better than any soap opera I'd ever watched. Tomorrow would bring call number 3, and I was curious to see which angle they'd try next. Call number 3 came from an unexpected source. Emma. Grandma Maggie? Her 7-year-old voice was serious, the way children sound when they're delivering messages from adults who don't want to make the call themselves. Hello, sweetheart. How are you? I'm good. Mommy said I should call you because you might be sad that we haven't talked since Christmas. Ah, the guilt deployment via grandchildren. I had to admire the strategy, even as it annoyed me. Using Emma as an emotional weapon was a new low, even for them. I'm not sad, honey. I've been very busy with work. Daddy says you're really rich now, and that rich people don't have time for family. I closed my eyes and counted to 5. The fact that Kyle was poisoning my granddaughter's perception of wealthy people to justify his own behavior was breathtaking in its manipulation. Emma, sweetheart, being rich doesn't make you love your family any less, but sometimes adults make things complicated when they shouldn't. Are you mad at Mommy and Daddy? Out of the mouths of babes again. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that you're not mad so much as deeply disappointed that the people who claim to love you have spent years treating you like a burden, then suddenly became very interested in your company once they discovered you could afford nice things? I'm not mad, sweetie, but I am sad that it took them this long to realize I'm not just someone who needs taking care of. I never thought you needed taking care of. You make the best cookies and you know how to fix my tablet when Daddy can't. Smart girl. She'd noticed what the adults had missed. I'd been taking care of everyone else for years. Emma, can you put Mommy on the phone? She says she's in the shower, but I heard her whisper that I should talk to you first to see if you're still angry. Of course she did. Because heaven forbid Brenna actually face an uncomfortable conversation head-on when she could use her daughter as a scout first. Tell Mommy I said that using you to test my mood isn't fair to you, and if she wants to talk to me, she should call herself like a grown-up. What does that mean? It means you shouldn't have to worry about whether adults are angry with each other. That's not your job. After I hung up with Emma, I sat in my office staring at my computer screen. The business was thriving beyond my wildest dreams. I had students sending me thank you notes from around the world. I had partnerships forming with major craft companies. I had respect in my industry and financial freedom I'd never imagined possible. So why did I feel so empty when it came to my family? The answer, I realized, was that I'd been grieving a relationship that had probably never existed the way I thought it did. I'd believed Brenna and Kyle loved me for who I was, but their recent behavior suggested they'd been tolerating me out of obligation. The money hadn't changed me. It had revealed who they'd been all along. My phone buzzed with a text from Brenna. Emma said you were upset about her calling. That wasn't my idea. Kyle thought it might be nice for you to hear from the kids. Even the apology was a deflection. Kyle's idea, not hers. Never any accountability for their own choices. I typed back, using children as messengers in adult conflicts is inappropriate regardless of whose idea it was. Her response came quickly. We're trying to rebuild our relationship here. Can't you meet us halfway? Halfway. As if the past 3 years of condescension and dismissal could be split down the middle like a dinner check. As if my hurt feelings were equally responsible for their disrespectful behavior. I started typing several responses and deleted them all. What was the point? They wanted access to my money, not insight into my feelings. They wanted to be forgiven, not to understand what they'd done wrong. Finally, I settled on, I'm not interested in rebuilding the same relationship we had before. If you want a new one, it starts with treating me like an equal, not like a problem to be managed or a resource to be accessed. No response came, which told me everything I needed to know about their priorities. That evening, I opened a bottle of good wine, ordered takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant, and spent 2 hours on a video call with my business partner discussing expansion plans for the European market. It was productive, engaging, and reminded me that there were people in the world who valued my intelligence and treated my time as precious. Later, as I was getting ready for bed, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Kyle standing on my porch holding a bouquet of grocery store flowers, the kind you grab from the bucket near the checkout counter when you've remembered at the last minute that you're supposed to be making an effort. I didn't open the door. Instead, I watched him stand there for 5 minutes, shifting his weight from foot to foot, before finally leaving the flowers on my doormat and walking away. The card tucked among the wilted carnations probably contained an apology that mentioned his good intentions and my unreasonable expectations. I left the flowers where they were. By morning, they'd be as wilted as his chances of easy access to my bank account. 2 weeks later, they made their real move. I was in my kitchen making breakfast when my doorbell rang at 7:30 in the morning. Too early for social calls, too persistent for delivery drivers. When I opened the door, Brenna stood there with mascara streaks down her cheeks and Jake balanced on her hip, both of them looking like refugees from a domestic disaster. "Mom, I'm sorry to bother you so early, but we need help." There it was, the crisis that would justify everything that came next. I'd been wondering what form their desperation would take, and apparently it was going to be dramatic. "What happened?" I asked, though I didn't invite them inside. "Not yet. Kyle lost his job yesterday. The company is downsizing, and he was one of the last hired, so—" She dissolved into fresh tears, which seemed a bit theatrical considering Kyle had been complaining about his boss for months. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I was, genuinely. "Come inside." I led them to the kitchen and poured coffee for Brenna while Jake immediately gravitated toward my cookie jar. At least someone in the family had consistent priorities. "How bad is the situation?" I asked, settling across from her at my small table. "Bad. Really bad. We've got the mortgage, the car payments, Emma's dance classes, Jake's daycare. Kyle's severance will cover maybe 6 weeks if we're careful." She wiped her nose with a tissue that had clearly seen heavy use already this morning. 6 weeks. That was either terrible financial planning or an exaggeration designed to heighten the urgency. Given their history of living beyond their means, it was probably both. "What about unemployment benefits?" "He'll get those, but it's not enough to cover everything." "Mom, I hate to ask, but you need money." She nodded miserably, and for a moment I saw my little girl again, the one who'd come to me with skinned knees and hurt feelings, trusting that Mommy could fix everything. The one who'd disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by this woman who'd spent 3 years treating me like an embarrassing obligation. "How much?" I asked. "Just to get us through until Kyle finds something. Maybe $3,000 a month for a few months? We'll pay you back as soon as we're on our feet again." $3,000 a month. That was $36,000 if they needed a full year, which they probably would in this job market. It was also a sum that would establish a financial dependency I suspected they'd never want to break. "Let me ask you something, Brenna. If I hadn't turned out to be wealthy, what would you have done?" She looked confused by the question. "I don't know. Borrowed from someone else? Sold the house?" "Sold the house. Downsized your lifestyle. Made the hard choices that people in financial crisis usually have to make." "But you can afford to help us," she said, and there was something in her voice that made my stomach clench. An entitlement that suggested my ability to help had somehow become my obligation to help. "Yes, I can afford it. But should I? Should you?" She stared at me like I'd suggested abandoning Jake by the roadside. "Mom, we're family." "We are. And as family, I love you enough to ask whether giving you this money would actually help you in the long run." Jake, oblivious to the tension, had discovered my tablet and was absorbed in a learning game I'd downloaded for his visits. Sweet boy. He deserved better than being used as a prop in his parents' financial drama. "What do you mean?" Brenna asked. "I mean that every time you and Kyle have gotten in over your heads financially, someone has bailed you out. Your father, when you bought too much house. His parents, when the business venture failed. Me, when you needed the wedding deposit. When does the pattern stop? This is different. This isn't our fault, isn't it? Kyle losing his job isn't your fault, but being unable to survive 6 weeks without borrowing money is absolutely a choice you made. You chose to have no emergency fund. You chose to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't afford on one income." She was crying again, but this time it felt more genuine. Less performance, more actual distress. "So you're saying no? You're going to let us lose our house?" "I'm saying I'll help you, but not the way you're asking." I got up and retrieved my checkbook from the drawer, along with a legal pad. Brenna watched me with the intensity of someone waiting for a verdict. "Here's what I'm willing to do," I said, sitting back down. "I'll give you $15,000, not loan, give, to help with the immediate crisis and give Kyle time to find work." "15,000? Her voice was small. "That won't cover everything." "No, it won't. It'll cover the absolute necessities while you make the hard choices you should have been making all along. Sell the second car. Take the kids out of expensive activities. Cancel the premium cable. Shop at discount stores instead of the fancy grocery chain." I wrote the check while she stared at me in disbelief. "This is a gift with one condition," I continued, tearing the check free but not handing it over yet. "You get financial counseling, both of you. Learn to live within your means before you dig yourselves into another hole." "But Mom, if you can afford more—" "I can afford a lot of things, Brenna. But what I won't afford is enabling you to avoid the consequences of poor financial planning. Take the $15,000 and the counseling requirement, or find another solution." She stared at the check in my hand like it was both a lifeline and an insult. "What if Kyle can't find work quickly enough? Then you'll downsize your life until he can. You'll discover what millions of families know. You can survive on less than you think you need." The silence stretched between us while Jake continued playing peacefully, unaware that his future was being negotiated over coffee and tears. Finally, Brenna reached for the check. "Fine, we'll take it, and we'll do the counseling." I handed it over, but I wasn't naive enough to believe this was the end of it. This was just round one. They'd be back when $15,000 wasn't enough, with bigger emergencies and more desperate tears. But at least now I knew exactly where we stood. And more importantly, so did they. The financial counseling lasted exactly one session. I knew this because Dr. Patricia Hoffman called me personally 3 days after Brenna and Kyle's appointment, which was highly unusual given patient confidentiality rules. But apparently, when someone storms out of a financial planning session screaming about manipulative mothers-in-law, exceptions get made. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," Dr. Hoffman said during our phone call. "Your daughter and son-in-law listed you as an emergency contact, and frankly, I'm concerned about their attitude toward financial responsibility. I was in my garden deadheading roses, one of those mindless tasks that lets you focus completely on someone else's drama." "What happened?" "Well, they spent most of the hour explaining why their situation was temporary and exceptional, rather than examining the spending patterns that created their vulnerability. When I suggested they sell one of their vehicles, your son-in-law became quite agitated. Let me guess, he said he needs the truck for work opportunities? Among other things, he also mentioned that you were being unnecessarily harsh given your financial capacity to simply solve their problems." There it was. Even in therapy, Kyle was focused on my obligation to fix their mess rather than their responsibility to change their behavior. Some people could find water in the desert and still complain it wasn't chilled. "Dr. Hoffman, did they discuss any concrete steps they were willing to take? Your daughter seemed more open to changes, but your son-in-law dominated the conversation. He kept returning to the theme that family members should support each other unconditionally. Unconditionally. That was rich coming from a man who'd spent 3 years treating me like an incompetent burden until he discovered I wasn't actually broke. What's your professional assessment? Honestly, they're looking for validation of their lifestyle choices, not genuine guidance for change. I've seen this pattern before. They'll likely seek out a different counselor who tells them what they want to hear. After hanging up with Dr. Hoffman, I wasn't surprised when my phone rang 20 minutes later. Brenna's number, but Kyle's voice. "Maggie, we need to talk about this counseling requirement." "Hello to you too, Kyle. How did the session go?" "It was a waste of time. This woman clearly doesn't understand our situation. She wanted us to sell the truck, which is insane because I need reliable transportation for job interviews." "Mm-hmm. And how many job interviews have you had so far?" Silence. Then, "The market is tough right now. It takes time to find the right opportunity." "It's been 3 weeks, Kyle. Have you applied for anything?" "I'm not going to take just any job. I have skills, experience. I'm worth more than minimum wage." Worth more than minimum wage. But not worth enough to his last employer to survive downsizing. Worth more than minimum wage, but apparently not worth enough to save an emergency fund. The cognitive dissonance was impressive. Kyle, let me ask you something. If I weren't in the picture, what would you be doing right now? What do you mean? I mean, if I didn't exist? If Brenna had no wealthy mother to turn to, what would your strategy be? Another pause. I guess we'd figure something out. You'd figure something out. Probably by taking any available work while continuing to look for something better, right? Maybe, but since I do exist, you've decided that figuring it out means convincing me to subsidize your unemployment while you hold out for the perfect position. That's not fair, isn't it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my existence has become your excuse to avoid making difficult decisions. I could hear Brenna in the background, her voice urgent but muffled, probably reminding him that antagonizing the Bank of Margaret wasn't the smartest strategy. Look, Kyle said, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was reasonable. The counseling thing isn't working. This woman has no idea what our expenses actually are. Maybe we could try a different approach. What kind of approach? Maybe you could help us directly instead of going through some stranger who doesn't know our family. And there it was. They wanted to eliminate the professional oversight and deal directly with me, where they could deploy emotional manipulation instead of facing objective financial analysis. You mean help you avoid accountability while I subsidize your poor choices? I mean help your family during a crisis. Kyle, I've been thinking about our situation and I've realized something important. You're not actually in a crisis. You're in a transition that you're choosing to handle irresponsibly. What's that supposed to mean? It means that losing a job is unfortunate but manageable if you make smart choices. Refusing to make those choices because you think someone else should solve your problems for you isn't a crisis. It's a character flaw. The silence that followed was so long I wondered if he'd hung up. Are you cutting us off? He asked finally. I'm requiring you to grow up. The 15,000 stands. The counseling requirement stands. And if you choose not to participate in genuine financial counseling, then you choose not to receive any future assistance from me. You're really going to watch your own daughter lose her house? I'm really going to watch my own daughter learn to take responsibility for her choices. There's a difference. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, watching the afternoon shadows lengthen across my lawn. Part of me felt terrible for being so firm with them. The maternal instinct to fix everything and protect my child from consequences was powerful. But a larger part of me felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of setting healthy boundaries and maintaining them. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Mommy is crying and Daddy is yelling. Are you still mad at us? That broke my heart, but it also reminded me why boundaries were necessary. Children shouldn't have to manage adult emotions or feel responsible for family financial problems. I texted back, I'm not mad at you, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make hard decisions. You don't need to worry about any of this. Then I turned off my phone and went inside to plan my next business expansion. They sold the truck. I found out 3 weeks later when Emma called me, chattering excitedly about their new adventure of sharing one car. Children have this remarkable ability to find joy in circumstances that send adults into existential despair. Daddy walks to the grocery store now, and he says it's good exercise, Emma reported, and Mommy drives him to job interviews when they're far away. It's like they're teenagers again. Out of the mouths of babes, apparently someone had managed to reframe financial necessity as romantic nostalgia. I had to admire the positive spin, even though I suspected Kyle was grinding his teeth every step of those grocery store walks. That sounds very practical, I said, genuinely proud of them for making at least one adult decision. Are you going to come visit us soon? Mommy says you're probably too busy being rich. I closed my eyes. Even when they were trying to be better, they couldn't resist the passive-aggressive commentary through my granddaughter. Grandma's not too busy for you, sweetie. But I am waiting for Mommy and Daddy to show me they're serious about making good choices. What kind of choices? How do you explain financial responsibility to a 7-year-old without making her feel responsible for her parents' problems? Grown-up choices about money and jobs and taking care of the family. 2 days later, Brenna called me herself. Her voice was different somehow, less performative than usual. Mom, Kyle found a job. That's wonderful. What kind of work? It's not what he was hoping for. Construction labor, not management. But it's 40 hours a week with benefits, and he starts Monday. I detected something in her tone that suggested this hadn't been Kyle's first choice or an easy decision for his ego. How does he feel about it? He's adjusting. The pay is less than his last job, but it's honest work, and we can make it work if we're careful. If we're careful. That phrase suggested they'd finally started looking at their actual expenses versus their actual income, which was more progress than I'd expected. I'm proud of you both, I said, and meant it. Are you? Really? There was something vulnerable in her voice, like my approval still mattered to her. Yes, it takes courage to accept reality and work with it instead of fighting it. Kyle wants to apologize to you. He realizes he's been difficult. That was a diplomatic way to describe his behavior, but I appreciated that they were attempting accountability. I'd be happy to hear from him when he's ready. There's something else, Mom. We've been talking, really talking, about how we've treated you over the years. Before we knew about your business success, I set down my coffee cup and gave her my full attention. This sounded like it might be heading somewhere genuine. I keep thinking about Christmas dinner, about what Kyle said about your knitting course, and I realized we've been dismissive of you for a long time, not just about business stuff, but about everything. Such as? Like when you tried to tell us about your book club, and we acted like it was cute that old ladies still read books, or when you learned to use social media, and we made jokes about grandmas on Facebook. We've been treating you like a stereotype instead of like you. This was more self-awareness than I'd heard from Brenna in years. But I'd learned to be cautious about apparent breakthroughs that might just be strategy sessions disguised as growth. Why do you think that happened? Honestly, I think it was easier. If you were just our aging parent who needed gentle management, then we didn't have to think of you as having your own life and dreams and capabilities. We could focus on our own problems without feeling bad about neglecting you. That was surprisingly insightful and painful, but in the way that truth often is. Thank you for telling me that, I said quietly. I want to do better, Mom. We both do. But I don't know how to undo 3 years of being thoughtless. You start by stopping. You don't need to undo the past, just stop repeating it going forward. We talked for another hour, and for the first time in years, it felt like a real conversation between two adults who respected each other. She told me about Kyle's wounded pride over taking manual labor work, and how she'd had to remind him that providing for his family was more important than protecting his image. She told me about the kids asking why they couldn't afford pizza anymore, and how she'd explained that sometimes families have to make sacrifices to stay together. By the end of the call, I felt something I hadn't experienced with my daughter in a long time. Hope. That evening, Kyle called. Maggie, I owe you an apology. His voice was subdued, none of the aggressive defensiveness that had characterized our recent conversations. I'm listening. I've been thinking about what you said, about me using your existence as an excuse to avoid difficult decisions. You were right. I was so focused on the fact that you could solve our problems that I stopped trying to solve them myself. That takes courage to admit. It takes desperation. We came close to losing everything because I was too proud to take the help that was actually available while waiting for the help I wanted you to provide. How do you feel about the new job? Like my back is going to kill me for the first month, he said with something that sounded like genuine humor. But also like maybe I forgot what it felt like to earn something instead of just expecting it. We talked for 20 minutes, and while I wasn't ready to forget 3 years of condescension, I was willing to acknowledge that people could change when consequences finally caught up with their choices. After both calls, I sat in my office looking at my business dashboard. Revenue was up 30% from last month. International expansion was ahead of schedule. I had partnership requests from companies I dreamed of working with just 2 years ago. But somehow, hearing genuine accountability from my family felt like a bigger victory than any business milestone. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Real change takes time, and people backslide when tested. I would celebrate this progress while remaining realistic about human nature. After all, I hadn't gotten wealthy by being overly trusting. 6 months later, my carefully maintained boundaries were tested in a way I never could have anticipated. I was in my office responding to emails from students when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brenna's number, but the voice that answered was Kyle's, and he was barely coherent. Maggie, you need to come to the hospital. Right now. My blood ran cold. What happened? Are the kids okay? The kids are fine. It's Brenna. There was an accident at her work, some kind of chemical exposure in the lab where she does billing. They rushed her to Metropolitan General. I was already grabbing my keys. How bad? Bad. They won't tell me much because I'm not technically next of kin, just her husband. But she's unconscious, and they're running tests to figure out what she was exposed to. Brenna worked for a pharmaceutical company, handling insurance claims in a building that housed both administrative offices and research facilities. The irony that she might be hurt at the job she'd taken to help stabilize their finances wasn't lost on me. 20 minutes later, I was in the hospital waiting room with Kyle, Emma, and Jake. The children were subdued but not panicked, suggesting Kyle had managed to explain the situation without terrifying them. "What exactly happened?" I asked Kyle, while the kids were distracted by a cartoon playing on the waiting room television. There was some kind of ventilation failure in the research wing. Several people were exposed to airborne chemicals before they could evacuate. Brenna was delivering paperwork to that department when it happened. How many people were affected? 6. 3 of them are conscious and seem okay. 2 others are in serious condition. Brenna, his voice broke. Brenna isn't responding yet. I put aside every resentment and frustration from the past year and focused on what mattered. My daughter was hurt, and my family needed me. Have you talked to her supervisor? The company should have detailed information about exactly what chemicals were involved. They're being cagey. Lots of talk about ongoing investigations and liability concerns. I think they're more worried about lawsuits than helping the victims. That sounded like corporate damage control, which was infuriating when my daughter's life might be at stake. Kyle, I need you to listen carefully. Don't sign anything the company gives you without reading it first. Don't agree to any settlements or liability waivers, and document everything. I don't understand. If Brenna was injured due to negligent safety practices, you may need to pursue legal action to cover her medical costs and lost income. These companies will try to minimize their exposure by getting victims to waive their rights before they understand the full scope of their injuries. Kyle stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. You want me to sue her employer? I want you to protect your family's interests. Right now, you don't know if Brenna will have long-term health effects or how much her treatment will cost. Don't give away your legal options before you understand what you might need them for. A doctor appeared in the doorway, looking for Kyle. We followed him to a small consultation room where he could speak privately. "Mrs. Hartley is stable but still unconscious," Dr. Garrison explained. "The chemical exposure caused severe respiratory irritation and possible neurological effects. We're monitoring her closely, but it's too early to determine if there will be lasting damage." "What kind of neurological effects?" I asked. "Potentially issues with memory, coordination, concentration. The chemicals involved are known to cause problems with cognitive function, but the extent depends on the level and duration of exposure." Kyle went very pale. "Is she going to wake up?" "We expect her to regain consciousness within the next day or 2. But her recovery process could be lengthy, and she may need extensive rehabilitation." After the doctor left, Kyle sat in stunned silence while I processed the implications. If Brenna couldn't work for months, if she needed ongoing medical care, if she had permanent disability, their fragile financial stability would collapse overnight. "Kyle," I said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to make some calls." "What kind of calls?" "First, call your insurance company to understand exactly what's covered. Second, document everything about today. Times, what the doctor said, what the company has told you. Third, start researching lawyers who specialize in workplace injury cases. I can't think about lawsuits right now. You can't afford not to think about them. If Brenna can't work for 6 months, how will you manage financially?" The question hit him like cold water. He'd been so focused on the immediate crisis that he hadn't considered the long-term implications. "I don't know," he whispered. "That's why you need legal protection. The company will offer you a settlement designed to make this go away cheaply. Don't take their first offer. Don't take their 10th offer until you know the full scope of what you're dealing with." "What if I can't afford a lawyer?" "Most personal injury lawyers work on contingency. They only get paid if you win." I paused, watching him struggle to process everything. "Kyle, I'll help with immediate expenses so you can focus on Brenna's recovery. But the long-term financial security has to come from holding the responsible parties accountable." "You'd help us? Even after everything? You're my family. When there's a real crisis, family shows up. That night, I drove Emma and Jake to my house so Kyle could stay at the hospital. As I tucked them into the guest room beds, Emma asked the question I'd been dreading. Grandma Maggie, is Mommy going to die? No, sweetheart. Mommy is sick, but the doctors are taking very good care of her. She's going to get better, but it might take some time. Are you going to help us? I smoothed her hair and thought about all the boundaries I'd established, all the tough love I'd delivered, all the lessons about consequences and responsibility. None of that mattered now. This wasn't about enabling poor choices or subsidizing irresponsible behavior. This was about protecting my family when they were genuinely vulnerable through no fault of their own. Yes, honey, Grandma's going to help. The lawsuit changed everything. Brenna woke up 2 days later with memory gaps and persistent headaches that the doctors said might be permanent. She couldn't remember the last 3 hours before the accident, struggled to follow complex conversations, and tired so easily that working was impossible. But the company's response to our legal inquiries revealed something that made Kyle's jaw drop and my business instincts start humming. They knew, the lawyer, Janet Morrison, explained during our first meeting 2 weeks after the accident. The ventilation system had been flagged for maintenance 6 months ago, but they delayed repairs to avoid shutting down the research wing during a critical project phase. They chose productivity over safety? Kyle asked. Not just chose. There are emails from the facilities manager explicitly recommending the delay, despite knowing the risks to personnel in adjacent areas. I leaned forward in my chair. What kind of risks did they know about? The exact type of exposure your daughter experienced. This wasn't an accident. It was a foreseeable consequence of a conscious decision to prioritize profits over worker safety. Kyle was staring at Janet like she'd announced aliens had landed. So this was preventable? Completely preventable with proper maintenance. And here's the interesting part. Your daughter wasn't the only one to suffer long-term effects. 2 other employees have similar symptoms, and there's evidence the company has been pressuring them to accept inadequate settlements to avoid publicity. How inadequate? I asked. $20,000 each for what could be permanent disability, affecting their ability to earn a living for the rest of their lives. $20,000. These people had been permanently injured through corporate negligence, and the company was offering them barely enough to cover a year's worth of medical expenses. What should we be looking at for fair compensation? Kyle asked. Janet consulted her notes. Given Brenna's age, earning potential, and the severity of her cognitive symptoms, we're looking at somewhere between $800,000 and $1.2 million, possibly more if her condition doesn't improve. Kyle went so pale I thought he might faint. That much money? That's what it costs to replace 40 years of lost earnings, plus medical care, plus pain and suffering, plus punitive damages for corporate negligence. I was doing rapid calculations in my head. If this case was as strong as Janet suggested, and if there were multiple victims with similar claims, the company was looking at a massive liability that they'd want to settle quickly and quietly. Janet, what if we coordinated with the other victims? Presented a unified case instead of letting them pick us off individually? That's exactly what I was thinking. Together, you have much more leverage than separately, but it means potentially years of litigation instead of a quick settlement. Years? Kyle looked panicked. Or, Janet continued, it means the company offers a substantial settlement to make this go away before it becomes a public relations disaster. I turned to Kyle. What's Brenna's opinion? She gets confused when we try to explain the legal stuff, the cognitive effects. It's hard for her to focus on complex information for very long. My heart broke for her, but it also clarified my role in this situation. If my daughter couldn't advocate for herself, then I would advocate for her. Janet, what do you need from us to move forward with the coordinated approach? Patience, mostly, and financial resources to cover expenses while we build the case. Kyle looked at me meaningfully, but I was already nodding. Whatever it takes. 6 months later, we were in settlement negotiations. The company had tried everything, denying negligence, claiming the employees were partially responsible for their own injuries, arguing that the cognitive effects were pre-existing conditions. None of it worked because Janet Morrison was ruthless and the evidence was overwhelming. But the real turning point came when a former employee contacted Janet with something that changed the entire scope of the case. This isn't the first time, the woman, Dr. Sarah Chen explained during a conference call. I left the company 8 years ago because they repeatedly ignored safety protocols. There were 3 other incidents involving chemical exposures that were covered up with non-disclosure agreements and inadequate settlements. Covered up how? Janet asked. Employees were told the exposure levels weren't dangerous, that any symptoms they experienced were coincidental. The ones who pushed for proper medical evaluation were suddenly laid off for unrelated reasons. Kyle and I exchanged glances. This was bigger than one incident of corporate negligence. This was a pattern of systematically endangering workers and covering up the consequences. "Do you have documentation?" Janet asked. I kept everything. Safety reports, email chains, medical records. I always suspected someone would eventually need proof of what was happening there. That night, Kyle called me from the hospital where he'd been visiting Brenna. "Maggie, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how you're going to react." "I'm listening." "Before all this happened, before Brenna's accident, I thought you were being cruel, withholding help when you could afford to give it, forcing us to struggle when struggle wasn't necessary." I waited for him to continue. "But watching how you've handled this situation, seeing how you immediately stepped up when we faced something we genuinely couldn't control, I realize I completely misunderstood what you were trying to teach us." "What do you think I was trying to teach you?" "That there's a difference between helping and enabling. That real help prepares people to handle challenges, not shields them from ever having to face challenges." It was the most perceptive thing I'd heard Kyle say in the 3 years I'd known him. "And?" I prompted. "And if you'd just given us money every time we asked for it, we never would have learned to be resourceful or resilient. When this real crisis hit, we would have been completely helpless instead of just partially helpless." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it through the phone. "Kyle, you've learned something that some people never figure out. The difference between a crisis and an inconvenience. Brenna losing her job because she made poor choices would have been an inconvenience we tried to turn into your emergency," he said quietly. "Brenna being injured through corporate negligence is an actual crisis that requires real help." "Exactly. I owe you an apology, Maggie. Not just for this year, but for every year since I married your daughter. I've been so focused on what you could do for us that I never appreciated what you were trying to teach us." After we hung up, I sat in my garden with a glass of wine, thinking about the settlement negotiations scheduled for next week. Janet was confident we could get close to $2 million, which would secure Brenna's future and send a message to other companies that worker safety wasn't optional. But more than the money, I was proud that Kyle finally understood the difference between support and dependency, between love and enabling. Some lessons can only be learned through experience. The settlement check arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, 18 months after Brenna's accident. $2.4 million. Split between medical expenses, lost wages, pain and suffering, and punitive damages designed to make sure the company never again chose profits over worker safety. But that's not the real story. The real story began 3 days later when Kyle called me with an unexpected confession. "Maggie, there's something I need to tell you about the original $15,000 you gave us." I was in my office, reviewing quarterly business reports that showed my knitting empire had expanded to 12 countries. Success had become routine enough that Kyle's serious tone immediately caught my attention. "What about it? We never spent it." I set down my coffee cup. "What do you mean you never spent it?" "I mean, it's been sitting in our savings account for over a year, untouched." "Kyle, that doesn't make sense. You said you needed it for mortgage payments and basic expenses." "We did need it. But the day after you gave it to us, something you said kept bothering me. You asked what we would have done if you didn't exist, and I realized we'd never actually tried to find out. I was completely confused." "So what did you do?" "We pretended the money didn't exist. We figured out how to live on just my construction wages. We sold stuff, cut expenses, took the kids out of expensive activities, learned to shop at discount stores." "But why keep the money if you weren't going to use it?" "Because having it there made us feel safe enough to make the hard changes. Knowing we had a safety net made it possible to walk the tightrope." I was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So when Brenna had her accident, we still had your 15,000 plus, almost a year's worth of savings from living below our means. We weren't financially devastated by her inability to work because we'd finally learned to live on less than we made." This was not at all what I'd expected to hear. Kyle, are you telling me you've been financially stable this entire time while I thought you were struggling? We were struggling at first, but we got our act together faster than either of us thought possible once we stopped looking for someone else to solve our problems. I thought about all the conversations we'd had over the past year, all the times I'd offered additional help that they'd politely declined, all the assumptions I'd made about their situation. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because we wanted to prove we could handle a real crisis before we admitted we'd figured out how to handle normal life. Brenna's accident was our test, and we passed. And now? Now we want to give you back your $15,000 plus interest. I started laughing. I couldn't help it. Kyle, you don't owe me interest on a gift. Maybe not, but we owe you an explanation of what that gift actually bought us. Which was what? Time to grow up. Space to fail without catastrophic consequences. And proof that we were more capable than we'd given ourselves credit for. Keep the money, I said. Put it toward the kids' college funds. Are you sure? I'm sure. But Kyle, I'm curious about something. What changed your mind about accepting help versus learning independence? There was a long pause. You want the honest answer? Always. It was watching you build your business, seeing how you transformed yourself from someone we thought needed our protection into someone who clearly didn't need anyone's protection. It made me realize that accepting limitation was a choice, not an inevitability. I felt tears prick my eyes. That might be the nicest compliment anyone's ever given me. It's the truth. You didn't just refuse to be diminished by our assumptions about your capabilities. You used our doubt as motivation to prove us wrong. And you decided to do the same thing with your financial situation? Exactly. Instead of accepting that we'd always need bailouts, we decided to prove we could stand on our own. That evening, I drove to their house for the first family dinner we'd shared since the previous Christmas. The difference was remarkable. Kyle looked genuinely confident instead of defensively aggressive. Brenna, despite her ongoing recovery from the chemical exposure, seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in years. The children were their usual chaotic selves, but the undercurrent of adult stress that had always permeated their household was gone. "Mom," Brenna said as we finished dinner, "I need to apologize for something." "What's that?" "Sweetheart? All those years we treated you like you were declining, like you needed our management and protection. I think we were actually describing ourselves." "How do you mean?" "We were the ones who were failing to thrive. We were the ones who needed help with basic life skills. But it was easier to project that onto you than admit our own incompetence." Kyle nodded. "We made you the problem so we didn't have to acknowledge that we were the problem." "And now?" I asked. "Now we're not problems anymore. We're just people figuring out how to live well." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the strange journey our family had taken. I'd set out to teach them about financial responsibility and ended up learning something about my own capacity for reinvention. They'd started by resenting my boundaries and ended up grateful for the space those boundaries created for their own growth. But the real revelation had nothing to do with money or business success or even family dynamics. It had to do with the discovery that people are capable of far more than they believe possible. But only if someone they love refuses to accept their limitations as permanent. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone is the refusal to rescue them from the consequences of their choices. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to become someone worth refusing to rescue. 6 months later, Kyle started his own construction business. Brenna, working within the limitations of her injury, became a part-time consultant for workplace safety firms. Emma learned to knit from my online tutorials and started a small business selling friendship bracelets to her classmates. And I continued building my empire, traveling to conferences around the world, and living a life that would have been unimaginable to the woman who sat at that Christmas dinner table 2 years ago, listening to her son-in-law mock her ambitions. But the best part wasn't the business success, or the financial freedom, or even the vindication of proving my doubters wrong. The best part was having a family that finally saw me clearly, not as a burden to be managed or a resource to be exploited, but as a person worthy of respect, capable of growth, and deserving of love that didn't depend on my utility to their lives. And that, more than any amount of money, was worth everything I'd gone through to earn it. Now I'm curious, have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who took you for granted? How did you find the courage to value yourself when others didn't? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of transformation and triumph. The truth is, it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Sometimes, you just have to stop letting other people convince you that your best years are behind you.